Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at data flow diagrams and how we can create those. They're a great tool for communicating how data moves through a business process or throughout a system. So let's get going. Our challenge is that communicating business processes and how they work in just sort of plain English and writing it down is a little bit hard because it's easy to misunderstand or to read a different meaning into something and that sort of thing. And so often we turn to diagramming because a picture is much more clear, and especially if we have some standards involved with drawing those pictures like we did with our flow charts and our entity relationship diagrams and our table maps and things like that, then we can be really clear. So it's like a common language that's easy to understand. And so we're going to learn another one now, and it's called data flow diagrams. And they really help us identify how data moves through a system. And that's a really important part of documenting what the different people who are going to use the system need, the stakeholders. So it shows the flow and transformation of data within a business process or a group of processes. And if you recall, back at the very beginning of the course, we talked about information. One of the definitions was data that's been processed. Maybe we add it up or sum it or average it or do something else more involved with it. Maybe we edit the data or add more data to it to come up with something new. Well, that's all part of the processing that goes on in various business processes. And that is kind of what we want to show with these diagrams. Where does the data go? What happens to it? How does it come out? All that sort of thing. It's a pretty common technique for modeling systems. It's standardized. It's well understood, and it's not just for techies. On the business end of things, being the users typically, and often the managers who want these systems, we have to understand it as well because that's our communication tool back and forth. All right. So they really help kind of articulate all of the business processes and data flows. Right. So when data gets transformed or moves from one process to another, call it a data flow. For example, accounting may send some information over to HR for a different process, or maybe to manufacturing, that kind of thing. Now, there's typically lots of different people involved in this, and we could be one of these people, couldn't we? So understanding some of this is pretty important for us. If we do a good job of this, we're going to get better insight into our system, and also we'll spot mistakes or issues before we actually start building a system, and maybe opportunities for improvement as well. So ultimately, if we do a good job, we're not only going to get a better system and a better design, we're also going to reduce the risk that something goes wrong. So two big benefits for us. Well, let's have a look now at what this is all about. There's some symbols we're going to use, and there's sort of two main standards out there. Sometimes you'll see variations on them, but let's have a look. The first set here is what are we called the Gain-Sarson ones. Those are the folks who came up with that. And the second one, here in green, does the same thing, just slightly different shapes. They're called the Jordan-DeMarco set. I don't mind which set you use, to be honest. I think I like the look of the first set better when I'm looking at a diagram, but they're a little harder to draw. And I think the second set's quicker and easier, and so I'm perfectly fine if you want to do that instead. Well, what are the symbols? We've got 4 of them in there. We've got a symbol for business processes, right? Things that happen. And in the first set here, the Gain-Sarson ones, it's a rounded rectangle. You'll notice here on the top, we've got the process number. We're going to number them so that we don't mix them up. And then we've got a description and a name for the process. Notice the very first thing here that we see is a verb. So we have a verb followed by some sort of object. In this case, we're going to process the credit card. All right, so that's an activity or a business process. Very similar over on the other side. Here we got process the credit card the same way, and we've got our number up here at the top. Maybe a little bit easier to draw. Data flows. Well, that's just showing the movement of data from one process to another. So the student details are moving from one process on the left to a new process on the right. Maybe they move from something in CamLink over to something that the instructor wants to use in D2L, for example, so student details. That's always a noun. All right, so we're looking at nouns here. Student details. Often the word details is in there, or data, something like that. By the way, one of the biggest mistakes I see on these is that people put a verb there. So they say process student details, but that's not a data flow, that's a process. So be careful with that. It should only be a noun on there describing what the data is. It's identical symbol when we do the Jordan DeMarco. So that's exactly the same. The next one up is a data store. That's just a place where data may sit for a while until we use it again. For example, we might have an inventory database or a customer file where one process, the data entry process, puts the data in, and it's not until the sales process fires up that the data is pulled out of the customer file. We draw these sort of an open-ended box on the right with a little square on the left and the name of the file here in the middle. In the Jordan DeMarco, even simpler, just an open-ended on either side kind of rectangle with the name of the customer file in the middle. Then finally, we've got external entities. Those are things outside of our process. So think about the marking process at the college that I use within D2L. Well, there's some external entities I might connect with. The student might be one. Maybe CamLink as an external system. So it could be a person. It could be other software. But it's not part of actually the D2L grading part. All right, so it's something external. Often it's a place where I get some data or I send data to. All right, and so they'll have lines coming in and going out of them typically. Symbol's the same for both. It's just a rectangle with the name of the entity in the middle, like customer or maybe CamLink or student or something like that. All right, so those are our main symbols, and you can use this kind of as a reference as you go and draw yours later. But let's look at a few rules for drawing them and some examples as well, and I'll give you a process for how we go through the whole thing. So a couple basic rules you can always follow to help you out. There should be a minimum of one data flow in and one data flow out of a process. All right. There could be more than one. You know, we could have data flowing out and going somewhere else as well, but there's got to be one in and one out. All right, because the data had to come from somewhere to get processed, and then it's turned into something else and sent on its way. So for example, I might have sales data coming in, and I might have a sales report coming out. All right, something like that. A database must be connected to a process, or a data store, I mean, not a database, a data store, either in or out or both. So in this case, the process over here puts some data into the data store, and in this one, brings it back out later for more processing. It could have gone off somewhere else too, right? We'll see some examples in a few minutes. An external entity has to be connected to a process, either in or out or both. Otherwise, why would we bother putting the entity there if it wasn't connected to our system? So it's obviously something relevant that we want to get some data from, perhaps. And then a single data flow only flows one way. Don't use double-ended arrows because we won't know what that data is. So instead of a double-ended arrow, draw two arrows, and that way you can label each one with the specific data. All right. So those are just a few basics, but keep those in mind. That already will start to make our diagrams more clear. Now we have different levels of a data flow diagram, we call it. We start with the highest level, which is what's called a context diagram. That's just the overview, kind of like the big picture of the system. Doesn't have much on it other than the name of the system itself and the external entities, but that's a good starting point. Then we can break it down and go a level deeper. We can say, okay, that main process, let's break that into the sub-processes. And we create our level 0 diagram from there. We may decide then that some of those processes should be broken down into sub-processes again, and we end up with a level 1 diagram, etc., etc. We can keep going to several levels if we want. We'll often find with just a level or two that we've got quite a bit of good detail, and that's all we need. But boy, there's some really comprehensive ones that can be very detailed. All right. So that's sort of the types, and in our course, we're only going to draw the context and the level 0. That's enough detail for us to learn how to do it without getting overly complicated, and I think you'll get a good feel for it that way. Now, there's a numbering kind of convention we want to follow. Every level is numbered. Remember I showed that. I said, we'll have a process, and it'll have a number on it. The very main one for my accounts payable system would be level 0. Then I might break that apart into some sub things like receiving the invoice and making the payment and updating the accounting ledger and things like that. Well, I would label those sort of 1, 2, and 3. If I wanted to break those into more detail, like I wanted to break the first one into even more detail, I'd call it 1.1, 1.2, etc. As far as I need to go. All right, so that's how we break it apart. Again, an example might be more helpful to you. I'll give you one in just a minute. Now notice the context level just has one process labeled 0 on it. Then to break that apart, I do level 0, which has processes labeled 1, 2, 3, etc. However many there are. And I go from there. All right. The number of decimals, if you notice that, the number of decimals over here matches the name over here. So at a level 2 diagram, I'll have 2 decimals on the go. All right. At the level 0, there's no decimals after each of these guys. And again, like I said, we're only going to go this far in our work in this course. All right. So you don't have to worry too much about the other things, but just so you know that we could go further if we wanted to. All right. Let's have a look at that context diagram then and see if we can figure one of these out. It's the highest level of a data flow diagram. It has only one process, and in this case, the process is not a verb followed by an object. It's actually the name of the system. So that's the one exception. So it's named with the system name. Okay, so that's a little bit different. All right. All external entities are shown. Now notice external entities, not internal entities, external. And those are the only kind we draw when we're talking about entities. They're in boxes, okay? And so not internal entities, just external. External to this particular system. Only the major data flows are shown, and there's no data stores. So this is going to be a very simple diagram. And let me show you one for the D2L grading system. So think about D2L, and when you do your quiz, you'll submit your quiz, and it'll get graded. You'll get a grade report back, and depending on the course and the type of quiz, it might show you the answers and other information. That's the kind of system I want to look at now. All right, so let's have a look at that. Here's the context diagram for that. In the center, I've got level 0, or process 0, the student grading system. So I've named it with the name of the system. Like student grading system or D2L grading system, something like that. I've got 3 external entities. Students aren't part of D2L, but they interact with it. Instructors aren't part of D2L, but we interact with it. And CamLink's not part of D2L, but it interacts with D2L as well. All right, so those are external entities. Let's see if we can figure out what happens here. The student submits some work, like a quiz, and the grading system grades it and returns the graded work. So the student submits work, that's the data that's going in, submitted work. So notice I say it's submitted work and not submits work because that would be called a process. This is actually describing the submitted work data. All right. What comes back out? Graded work. After it's all done, comes back out and goes to the student. Separately from that, the instructor at some point, probably earlier, but doesn't show time on this diagram, set up the grading parameters. So I might have said, oh, quizzes are worth 10% and we'll drop to lowest quiz. Set all those rules up for that. Put that into D2L. And from time to time, the instructor may ask for a grading report to come out of the system as well. How are my students doing? How's Fred doing? How's Sally doing? That kind of thing. And we can get those grade reports so we can follow up and check on people. So that's fine. That might be the kind of interactions that I have as an instructor. Notice, again, it doesn't say which one's first or second or anything like that, and they're not necessarily going to happen in order, but that's okay. It's just showing how the student grading system takes information from the instructor and provides something valuable back. All right, so some grading parameter data goes in. Parameter means the rules, right? So the grading rules go in, and a grading report, that's some good information, comes back out. Now that grading report wouldn't be possible without two things. The student submitting work and the grading parameters coming in. Those two things end up coming out in a grade report, don't they? All right, so somehow the student grading system is processing that. There's a third one on there too. The part of this probably happened at the very beginning where CamLink had to send a class roster or class details to D2L. That would have happened at the very beginning of the term, wouldn't it? And then at the very end of the term, much later, the final grade gets sent from D2L to CamLink. All right. This is already an interesting document because I can point out to someone a big flaw. I can say, look, that very last one here doesn't happen automatically. Instructors have to open D2L on one side of their computer screen, CamLink on the other, and then manually type the grades. That's wrong in so many ways. It's time consuming and costly, and it's prone to error, isn't it? Wouldn't it be better if we wanted to improve D2L and CamLink if we linked the two of them together so that could just happen through the software? Right? So already this diagram can be a useful thing for talking with the system designers and that sort of thing. All right. But it is pretty basic. I've only got really a couple things on here. But can I take it a step further? Sure. Let's look at the level 0 now where I say, let's break out that middle process and describe it in more detail into sub-processes. So let's do that next. The level 0 diagram, that's where we expand the context diagram main process into sub-processes. That gives us a more detailed look. Now the entities aren't going to change, are they? The entities will stay the same because, that didn't change. We just want to examine in more depth that centerpiece, right? So I'm going to show you the next diagram, and you'll see the entities stay the same. All I did was push them out a little further so that I'd have room to break everything down in the middle. All right, let's take a look. Wow, look at that. That looks more exciting already. More complicated, but it's not so bad if we just focus in and see if we can work our way through it. So first off, do you notice that the three entities are all still there? Student, instructor, and CamLink. I kind of left them in the same area, just moved them a bit further apart. What's changed though is this whole middle piece here is what on the last diagram was just called the student grading system. Now it's broken into its subparts, and I've got 4 sub-processes: creating the grade book, grading student work, producing a grade report, and assigning a final grade, and 1 data store, the grade book itself. There's a grade book in D2L. You can't see it. Well, you can see your piece of it, but when I open D2L, I see the whole class in a great big spreadsheet with all the grades, right? So that's the grade book data store. All right. So what's happening here? Well, a student does some work, and that work is submitted. So the submitted work, or the student work, goes in. There's a process called grade student work. So there we go. Notice we got a verb, grade, and what are we grading? We're grading the student work. Okay. I've labeled that number 2 here. Well, somehow, and D2L will often auto-grade, won't it? Let's imagine it's a multiple choice quiz. It will grade the work, and it'll put a grade into the grade book. And it will also send that grade back to the student along with some feedback perhaps. All right, so 1 data flow went in and 2 came out of that process. And that's it. That's all that process does. Now, could I break that into more pieces? Sure. Maybe the first thing is, what kind of work is this? Is this auto-graded or instructor graded? And then it separates into a couple different processes from there, right? But we're only going to go to this level. So that's enough detail for now. There's a few other things going on. Let's look at process 1. I put it way over on the right. Numbering doesn't matter too much as long as I've got a unique and a different number for each one. Creating the grade book, I called it number 1 because I imagine that would have actually have to be done first at the beginning of the term. What happens there? Well, we take data from the class roster. We take the parameters from the instructor, and that would be things like, okay, for this course, there's 2 midterms and a final and 10 quizzes. The midterms are worth 25% each, the quizzes are worth 10, the final's worth 40, something like that. Let's imagine it's a finance course, and takes that information along with the class roster and builds that big gradebook spreadsheet, right? So it creates a gradebook, and so that data flows over there to help create that data store. All right, so gradebook data helps us with the gradebook data store. That's the second one. Let's look at number 3 up top, produce grade report. Well, I have to take all the details for the class, do something to them, and then I can send a report to the instructor. Maybe that report comes out with highlights on it showing which students are potentially in trouble, which students are doing great, if there are some students who are late on something, all sorts of things like that. If students missed an exam or a quiz, etc. All kinds of good things could come out of there as different reports. So there'd be a grade report. And then number 4 over on the left-hand side, assigning the final grade. Well, how does that work? Well, we take data from the grade book, all the details. We develop and create a final grade, and that's fairly automatic within D2L once all the grades have been entered. And we put it in the grade book. We also somehow transfer that data to CamLink. And I said a minute ago, maybe I complained a minute ago, but I said that was a manual process, right? Doing that piece along the way there, but doesn't matter. I'll just show the data flow that the final grade goes to CamLink. How it gets there, we don't care. Right? Could be computerized, could be manual. That part's not so important. All right. And so that's the D2L grading system, broken down into more depth. Now, each of these we might say, I'd like more detail on how that final grade gets assigned, or I'd like more detail on how student work is graded, or I'd like more detail on how to create the grade book. And then we would, let's say we were doing the grade book in more depth. I would create process 1.1 and 1.2 and maybe 1.3 and 1.4 to show all the different sub-processes. that would be on a different sheet of paper, a different diagram, and I would know that I could reference back to this. All right, so this diagram could spawn several subsheets from here, right? So that's fine. So there's our completed data flow. Let's look at a few issues that I see happen when people first start learning how to do these. And I'll tell you about them. Maybe you can avoid them when you're doing yours. One common mistake is something called a black hole. It's where we have a process and data is coming in, but nothing goes out. So we have a process where it's taking all kinds of data, but doesn't do anything for us. Well, what's the purpose of that? That's just a black hole. It's sucking everything in, not giving us anything back. No need to have that on there. The opposite is where we have a process where data flows out, but nothing went into it. So it's spewing off data and information for us, but based on nothing. So that would be a miracle. So the second one there doesn't make sense either. And there's another one that if we look at the picture sort of quickly, it looks reasonable. There's data coming in and out. But if we look more closely, look at that picture I've got. Student details and grade details go in, and the instructor paycheck comes out. Those things are unrelated, aren't they? At least at Camosun. My paycheck doesn't change if you do well or if you don't do well. Totally unrelated. And we call that a gray hole. The data coming out isn't related to what went in. All right. So it wouldn't make sense. That's a few common errors. I'd like you to keep those in mind as we go through the process now of building our DFD. I'm going to take you through 4 steps. We're going to identify, we'll start with a little written narrative, like a paragraph or 2 about how the grading system works. And then I'll go through that and try to circle and box and highlight different things, like what are the external entities? What are the processes? What are the data stores? Once I've got those, I can draw my DFD. Now, if it's a fairly long one, I may even try to make a little table, sorting all that out. But for short ones, we can probably just highlight and circle and underline, and we'll be good enough to go. So we'll dive right in and draw the DFD. All right, let's have a look at an example. Typically, we get some sort of narrative written down on sort of what happens, or we may take notes when we're talking to somebody. And so in this case, we've got a few notes. CamLink sends a class roster to D2L. The instructor establishes grading parameters and sets up a gradebook, presumably in D2L or our system as well. The student submits work for grading. Once graded, the gradebook is updated and the work is returned to the student. Class details are taken from the gradebook to create a grade report for the instructor, and grading detail from the gradebook is used to assign a final grade, which is sent to CamLink. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is identify those external entities. All right, so anything external to our little system. So D2L wouldn't be external because that's the system itself, but CamLink, the instructor, and the student are all external entities, aren't they? They're things that interact with our grading system. Maybe places we get information from or send information to. CamLink is software. The instructor and the student are people. They can both be external entities. So I've identified them and put little boxes around them. The next step then that I want to look at is to go and identify the processes. So I put ovals around those, and that kind of matches what they'll look like when we draw them with our DFD as well. Creating a gradebook is one, grading is another, produce a grade report, and assign a final grade. We can kind of get some clues here to these. Create grade report, there's a verb and an object. Produce grade report, assign final grade. Those are all verbs followed by a direct object, which is what we said processes would be, didn't it? Now there's another one here, grading. Sometimes it's not worded just the way we want, but isn't that really just another way of saying grade? Grade student work or submitted work. So again, we have a verb and an object, and so that fits in there too. So we can kind of read through carefully and try and spot all of those things and put ovals around them. All right, so I'm starting to try to categorize or clarify the written instructions. In the process of doing that, I might have more questions for the person who wrote them, um, but ideally by the end I can sort it out and pull out each thing I need. Now there's something else we want to look for, and that would be places where we store data when we're not using it. So let's look at the data stores. I only found one when I went through here, and that was the grade book. All right. So the grade book is a place like maybe a little database or something like that, or an Excel file that gets updated from time to time with student grades, and then gets used later to produce things. So I could underline it again. See, it shows up later as well in several spots. But it's the same grade book, isn't it? So once should be enough. I know there's a grade book that needs to be taken care of when I get to drawing my DFD. So now we've got everything we need all set up to go ahead and start drawing our DFD. The other thing we have to think about and add is what flows between all of these things. And we can get some wording from this text as well when we get to the drawing stage. Let's go back to our picture. We have our three entities, external entities. That's the only kind there are. We had our four processes, and we had our one data store. Once we draw all those out, then we can think about what's the data that flows between them. Maybe there's some information about that in the narration. I think of the narration said class details are taken from the grade book to produce a grade report for the instructor. Well, class details taken from the grade book to produce a grade report for the instructor. So I can just write class details on there. So we can quickly start to fill this in and flesh it out and have a good DFD. Once I've got that, I sit down with the people involved, both the systems people and the users and everyone else, and we go, does this look right? Is there something wrong with this, or is it okay? And then we can make sure we can improve it before we build it if we need to, or clarify it in some way. All right, so that's the process for drawing a DFD. That's it, right? It's complicated enough, I guess, already, but let's not make it any worse. So that's how we do it. All right, so I'm going to give you a chance to try one. That's the best way to learn them, of course. And I've created. So now it's time to try out a DFD exercise for yourself, and I've got all the details posted in D2L for you. Don't forget, we've got other resources in D2L for this whole chapter, so make sure you do kind of explore the content real well. And then if you haven't already, finish up chapter 5. Make sure that you get the quiz done and the simulation as well on the textbook website. All right, thanks.